Yeah, and I don't mean it sarcastically. I love doing this. This is my Zen meditation, as silly and weird as that may sound.
Actually, twice a week.
Yeah, twice a week actually, and soon three. So it's gonna be a why not? That's what we haven't decided yet, but I think I'm going to start pushing us into doing a more regular sort of. We're doing a thing with drifts that I really like, and we started having sort of random conversations, more of a schizoanalysis of things, but a little bit of a procedural sort of process. And I'm trying to make it so I regularly bring in a text or two related, push people, keep it moving. And I think I've got to figure out what that looks like. But it was like early on, Jack started one of the first side groups besides AO, which was our literature group. And the way it functioned was really strange because it was kind of every week a new book, a new text, a new reading, and it kept a really nice vibe going because it just was like it wasn't as heady. I mean, some of the texts were, but generally it's not like I read 3 paragraphs in a row and now my brain's dead. It's more, hey, oh yes, no, the people who walk like wonderful texts. So
Wants to
like
walk away from home a lot.
yeah, like Ursula Le Guin, like just amazing pieces that are not hard reads at all, um, but like really interesting reads, and it kept a good vibe. So I'm trying to figure out how we do more groups like that, which I think can be positive. We'll see. Um, Today's going to be a fun one because we had one question submitted, so we're going to end up mostly, I think, just having a general conversation around it. We'll see what happens. Who knows?
Thought we were here
But
to talk about the nuances of James Cameron and Charles Chaplin.
oh, dude. Actually, maybe.
Yeah, there we go.
Maybe. Um, because a film definitely plays into this. But I'll go ahead and kick us off, and today's going to be different, and I'll talk about how kind of we do this because we haven't done one of these in almost just over a year. And I think it's worthwhile, so we'll talk through it. But first off, I want to say hello and thank all of you for joining us today at the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. This is our second time around and our second time through 4.3, finally having completed the entire section. Dear God, it's a lot. And there's just a metric ton in there. And this time around, we ended up taking, I think, more time through 4.3, which is good, but there's still a lot of points that I think got left by the wayside. And so much of it is absolutely central to not only the entire book, but as we move into the positive tasks of schizoanalysis, understanding the negative, understanding how capitalism functions within desire and plays with it is just flat necessary. So we thought we would take today, and rather than jump straight into 4.4, we'd spend some time talking through, any questions or uncertainties people may have around various bits. I know we have one person who's got a question, the only person who submitted one. Well done, server. But we'll wait for Brendan to join. When we get to that, we will re-ask the question then. Basically, his question was, what is a psychotic? Because it seems like they don't have a lot of standards in that. And I'll just go ahead and link his comment in the words get used in psychoanalytic theory randomly. So we'll get to that, but sort of to kick us off, because I think the best place to kick us off would be at the beginning. That first paragraph, I want to talk through it because to me it is, I think, a descriptor of what they are trying to say through the rest of the section. So just to quickly read through it. The schizoanalytic argument is simple. Desire is a machine, a synthesis of machines, a machinic arrangement, desiring machines. The order of desire is the order of production. All production is at once desiring production and social production. We therefore reproach psychoanalysis for having stifled this order of production, for having shunted it into representation. Far from showing the boldness of psychoanalysis, this idea of unconscious representation marks, from the outset, its bankruptcy or its abnegation, an unconscious that no longer produces, but is content to believe. The unconscious believes in Oedipus, it believes in castration, in the law. It is doubtless true that the psychoanalyst would be the first to say that, everything considered, belief is not an act of the unconscious. It is always the preconscious that believes. Shouldn't it even be said that the psychoanalyst who believes, it is the psychoanalyst who believes, the psychoanalyst in each of us? Would belief then be an effect on the conscious material that the unconscious representation exerts from a distance? But inversely, who or what reduced the unconscious to this state of representation, if not, first of all, a system of beliefs put in the place of productions? In reality, social production becomes alienated in allegedly autonomous beliefs at the same time that desiring production becomes enticed into allegedly unconscious representations. As we have seen, it is the same agency, the family, that performs this double operation, distorting and disfiguring social desiring production and leading it to an impasse. There's this paragraph, I think, actually outlines very nicely how they're going to spend the majority of this critique of psychoanalysis and this critique of capitalism in this section, with that first line being essentially it. Ultimately, desire is a machine. These machines connect as they do and they produce. Everything ultimately is out of production. However, there is representation, and the critique of representation that they've been making throughout the entire book sort of comes to a very sharp point that representation has taken over and is now a thing that we utilize to believe in things, not to know, not to experience, not to have built ourselves, but instead to believe in patriotism, America, wealth, all of these ridiculous things. We're content to believe. This to me is a wonderful paragraph to start with, and I just wanted to make sure everyone is generally comfortable with how I just sort of explained it, because I think it's we'll say a starting point, a foundational point, you might say.
So the schizoanalytic argument is really an argument for the natural desiring production, right, and social production. That's a natural form of thought and behavior, right?
Yeah, essentially saying there is an emergent nature to things, even social things. There's a productive nature, and this would be also their critique of capital. And as Deleuze outlined, he believes it's also ultimately Marx's critique of capital, the way it functions. That we've kind of gotten to this point where production ultimately produces value, but somehow we've gotten it to the point where value somehow produces production, or we believe this is the case, this quasi-cause, the sebarabatsur, the falling back on production that the socius, or the body without organs, does, is this weird movement of pretending that representation, or the thing that is emergent, is actually the cause. I think I would ask JK, Jack asked too. The use of the word natural is the only thing that, like, I would say I felt like a record scratch, because it's not so much like, if you mean natural as in non-determinate, or sort of happens on its own organically, emergently, that I would agree with, if that's the meaning, I guess. Jack, JK.
Yeah, that's what I meant. That it is the healthy, the human being, right, coming into the world with these desiring productions, and but it's taken over by the representations of the socius and the belief systems of psychoanalysis and capitalism. So he's going to go into talking about myths and legends that represent that kind of belief system.
Yeah, I would even say it's a little bit even smaller than saying, like, because it is capitalism. He is saying that it is psychoanalysis, but it is the family where it starts. It's the parent who tells the child, "Shh, you're not supposed to talk in here. Don't jump around like that. Eat your food. Finish your plate. If you're good, you'll get a toy later." these sorts of things, uh, the nuclear family is effectively in charge of axiomatizing any subject and treating them and teaching them that it's less about the emergent life that they're living, but instead learning to conform to the rules and representations you're told in order to function. So the family tends to be the place where a lot of this actually starts.
Is he saying that the family is also a victim of this, of the socius and victim of this kind of uh,
But
representation?
part of the machinery, I'm hesitant to say victim, I would say part of the machinery. They're produced through representation and through this process of production and this falling back on. And so it's like, so calling it a victim, calling any single instantiation of things like a victim or a cause or anything like that, I think I would be hesitant. More saying the nature of the family machine is that the family, the father, the mother, and the child has all of his social realities filtered through the parents, and as such, the lens of the parents and the way they tell him to behave in society ultimately causes the way he sees society, not an emergent sort of reality of, oh, I've experienced this without, interference or having everything reduced to these states of representation. An example, we recently, where I live, the neighborhood, just in general, I think everywhere is seeing a weird uptick in the perception of crime. And a neighbor of mine, who's a very nice guy, and he's got a couple kids, made a comment that, I have a lot of sympathy for people, I have a lot of empathy, but it's just, these are just lazy people who are stealing. It's the only reason they steal. And that kind of thing and that lesson that's being taught is what we're talking about here. It's laziness for someone to steal. That's the drive and the reason they're doing it. This representation of why a thief does it, or instead of the, sort of gathering what someone's sort of lived experience is, or how desiring machines connect, I think is sort of a good example of that. Jack, I know you've been wanting to chat for a second. No,
Which
go for it.
I don't want to.
No, this
I
is
mean,
meant to be, this is meant to be like a open conversation like that. So like, cause we don't have I wanted to kick us off on the first paragraph because I do think, and I don't think anyone's going to disagree, it's a really nice, crisp way of sort of summing up what we're going to be talking about. And then we can kind of use the questions we get from here to sort of bounce around the section. Unless anyone disagrees with that, I think it's how I'm hoping to do it.
Yeah, I'm okay with bouncing around. I don't think we have to go paragraph. I mean, we've already done paragraph by paragraph. Um, yeah, the only reason I question the use of the word natural is just because there's a lot of baggage with that term. JK, I suspect you're using it because we read the Lucretius essay yesterday, and that was one of the big surprises for me in the essay is that Deleuze does qualify a naturalism, right? And qualify an essentialism, which like it's really surprising. But yeah, I mean that's certainly one question we can ask here is like, what would naturalism mean in a conversation about desiring production, right? Because the similarity is certainly that he maintains here and with Guattari a use of production, right? And a pain to clarify the distinction between production and product. But there's also a different stake here, right? Which is that, um, I mean, at some level, difference is a common theme in his work, but something's going on here, right? Where Deleuze is not worried about difference being thought of in the same anti-natural way, even though some of that does come to bear on what we're reading here, yeah. Kind of shifts kind of a different argument in some ways, yeah.
Well, I think the example of family is probably a good way for us to start parsing what he means when we say natural or how we're talking about it. Because again, um, everyone will always have in essence a biological father and mother. Like we have families, we have people we grow up around, whatever we may call them. There is a collective of sorts. We're not solo creatures that are left to fend for ourselves, dropped in a field by our mother and left to go. Like there isn't a natural sort of social side to that. The way family functions within capital, as they go into it, bottom of 297 is the part I'm going to quote real quick. Of course, the father acts on the child's unconscious, but does he act as a head of a family in an expressive familial transmission, or rather, as the agent of a machine in a machinic information or communication? And he uses the example of Judge Schreber. Schreber's desiring machines communicate with those of his father, but it is in this very way that they are from early childhood the libidinal investment in the social field. In this field, the father has a role only as an agent of production and anti-production. This this play that he's talking about here, which is an evolution sort of Freud, is again, this is not so much saying that the father is out of nowhere doing a thing or that it's a generalized familial transmission, but instead that there are parts of machines and machines and machines, and that the family is ultimately connected to all of them. And they are, for lack of a better word, almost the bubble around the child. They are the machines that feed information in and out the flows of whatever is happening socially. And this setup changes things. The production couple, the desiring machines, and the social field give way to a representative couple of an entirely different nature, family myth. Once again, have you ever seen a child at play? How he already populates the technical social machines with his own desiring machines. The very easy way to sort of say this, and I watch my son do it a lot with Legos or magnetiles and all sorts of block stuff that he can connect. Whatever is happening, he literally is building machines. And he says this, and it's the weirdest thing. I didn't teach him this. I don't even like use these words, but he will put it together and he'll go, this is a shooter machine. This is a chopping machine. And he like builds like weird shit. It's nonsensical, but he refers to it as this. It's absolutely the way that he thinks. He's wanting to build things that interact, that deal with the world, that do these things. And as such, I am, without almost thinking about it, I am building machines for him when I critique or when I comment or when I teach him about social things outside of him, very much in the same vein. And his desiring machines are constantly trying to connect to that.
Just thinking of what might be a good way to distinguish between like the family acting as an apparatus of the social machine and the family acting as familial and I guess expressive is the word that Deleuze and Guattari are using here. And like the example I'm thinking of from my own childhood was when I was like in the Boy Scouts growing up, and at some point all of my friends had left and I was the last one in it, and I wanted to quit, and my dad made me stay in it to finish out the last badges because like he thought it's a good thing to teach your son to stick to something and finish it. And so there's this way that he's like relaying this social message, and his relation to me as like my father in the sense of both biological and familial love is those are totally incidental. It's more about the proximity of the father or the parent and their status as an authority figure that allows them to function as like a relay in the machine.
Yeah, and you don't even know you're doing it as a parent. It's terrifying. You'll find yourself. I've used the example before where I said to my son, "Well, you need to finish your plate." I don't know why I told him this. He didn't want to eat the rest of the food. What a silly thing! But it's like embedded in me because my parents very much that was the rule of the house. And these little things essentially are building things that are then coextensive with the delirium, with social delirium, with the field of delirium that sort of exists as that position. Who are we culturally, socially? What's our place in sort of all of this? Very often you will even hear people say, we're debating, by the way, about whether or not to send our kid to school, how we're going to do it. You can't do public. It's a nightmare. But very quickly, the first response most people have is, if you don't send them to school, how will they get along with anyone socially? And it's this really strange acknowledgement of the number one sort of purpose of that, or of a parent or anyone when they're teaching a child, is how will they get along in the delirium? How will we adjust them properly? And we even use the term, we need to make sure your child's properly adjusted to the world, which is interesting that we even use such explicit terms. But this is the role of the parents. And it's again, not wild as a thing to say. Parents, that's their job, is to prepare you for the world, to teach you how to be, to do all sorts of things, from tell you how Santa Claus only gives the good kids toys, and that's why the poor kids don't have any, as an example. Terrible lessons, I think, that people do internalize and start to learn the myths of things, the way that we're supposed to be, the areas you don't go to. Why don't you? I just said you don't, and I'm in charge, and that's my job as the man and the father. These things are said, and they're said quickly, and they very much teach the way that we're supposed to be, the lines of our lives that we're supposed to obey. The line I think I like in here, the father will be inflated with all the forces of myth and religion and with phylogenesis, so as to ensure that the little familial representation has the appearance of being coextensive with the field of delirium. So I will continue talking if no one else is going to. I can literally go for fucking hours. In line with that, they then continue, and they immediately dive into Miller. Oedipus, or Hamlet, led to this point of autocritique. The expressive forms, myth and tragedy, denounced as conscious beliefs or illusions, nothing more than ideas. The necessity of a scouring of the unconscious. Schizoanalysis as a curettage of the unconscious, the metrical fissure in opposition to the line of castration. This huge rant they go on. This play is very much about moving away from the tragic representation, getting back to the term natural. Now I'm going to use, God damn it, JK, but it's a fair one. Getting back to the connective structure that is at the base, our desire as it's produced, as it connects, as it does things, rather than the representations which I believe they produce, but ultimately stifle them or control them. Explicitly talking about Nietzsche as he moves forward, and then Foucault in the same way, and talks through this huge play towards Freud discovering this desiring economy, the same way that Ricardo realized that labor is a thing that could be abstracted. Freud is able to abstract desire, and we need to understand how that operates and how that plays as a separate part of production, and how it produces through these connections and the things that it builds in the machines of desire and ultimately social production that are coextensive. And these elements that move, that ultimately do produce the representations, but then we do this funny thing where we have the representations pretend like they produce the desire.
Oh. I have
Misha, hello.
a question. Hello. What's up? Quick question, and that is in the last paragraph of the section. They talk about, I think that's a bit of a famous line. Oh wait, now I can find it. The one that we haven't with the deterritorialization, we haven't seen anything yet.
Yes.
But now I'm reading over it now. But so
Producing a new land. Is that the line you're talking about? The last paragraph of. So you want us to move from the first to the last paragraph? We're just skipping the whole middle. Is that how we're doing it for you, Misha?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. To just say, I think what I think you're talking about. That is what the completion of the process is, not a promised and a pre-existing land, but a world created in the process of its tendency, its coming undone, its deterritorialization. The movement of the theater of cruelty, for it is only the theater of production, there where the flows cross the threshold of deterritorialization and produce a new land, not at all a hope, but a simple finding, a finished design where the person who escapes causes other escapes and marks out the land while deterritorializing himself. An active point of escape where the revolutionary machine, the artistic machine, the scientific machine, and the schizoanalytic machine become parts and pieces of one another. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. but the specific quote I can't find. Maybe it's earlier in the text. But I was wondering on our ongoing playing with accelerationism, because this to me sounds exactly like why Deleuze can be framed in a way accelerationist. No.
Well, there's some assumptions that go with that. So first, we have to assume that when we talk about deterritorialization, that we're pushing and accelerating, but we're not. I don't foresee that there's a necessity that we have one follow the other necessarily. Some make the interpretation that when he says deterritorialization, he's referring specifically to capitalist deterritorialization and its function, and that we should do what we can to accelerate that. To me, to just, it's fair, Jack, to qualify accelerationism, it's the idea that, at least in my understanding of the readings I've done, that the contradictions within capitalism and ultimately the way that it functions, we can push on the gas, light a fire underneath it, you might say, to cause deterritorialization to happen more and more quickly until we get to a point where capitalism can't handle it and we find what comes next. Is that a fair?
Yeah, although I think actually Deleuze and Guattari seem to put it here, in my opinion, more like not necessarily to push it to its own destruction, but rather to just push its tendency further and further and further, instead of trying to find a complete molar alternative. and that's when they say, when it comes to the retaliatorizations of the neurotic retaliatorizations and the psychotic reterritorializations, they cry out more perversion, more artifice, to a point where the earth becomes so artificial that the movement of deterritorialization creates of necessity and by itself a new earth.
So, my first question would be, I don't see how this is involving the molar. I get that it is generally speaking coextensive, but the very clear line they have through most of this is that they are focused on the, I wouldn't say the subject, but the personal, maybe the subject, where it's about, they use the term one, within one person. We cry out more perversion, more artifice, to a point where the earth becomes artificial. Yes, but they're not necessarily talking about the earth fully at grand. They're talking about the familial neurosis in the couch, the little island with its commander, the psychoanalyst. They're talking about the parts of a person, the setup there, because then at that point, it's not that the world changes. I tend to be very in line with Holland's take on this, that it's not so much about an accelerationist perspective, but instead almost a destruction of the fascist within. And that at some point you actually personally enter a state of what might be termed a permanent revolution, that you just simply are always in that place yourself. And by doing so, lands don't mean anything to you. Quite literally, you're always in a new land. You find it, there is a finished design. The person who escapes it naturally is causing other escapes just by being in the position that they're in. It's a very, I would say, molecular view of it rather than a molar view. It's why I've never really understood the accelerationist take, because they've never really focused on here's what we do as a society. They're very almost like Buddha-like focused on the working on yourself and the fascist within, rather than, oh, here's how you change society. It's like you can't change society until you've fixed yourself, and by changing yourself, you naturally cause escapes in others, and therefore can cause that knock-on effect.
Okay, now I'm very confused.
How so?
I don't recognize that thing in what you said about accelerationism, about the focusing on the self.
No, I'm saying accelerationism doesn't.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
Sorry, I specifically
Yeah.
accelerationism focuses on what we can do at the meta level, at the molar level. We need to vote for Trump. Like that, I've heard accelerationists say that.
Oh, yeah. So exactly. So that's what I'm trying to say. Is that my original point was, I feel like D&G right now are posing a molecular accelerationism.
You mean molar?
No. No, right? Like at the molecular level, they want more artifice. No?
Ye-
I think your mic is kind
yes,
of quiet. Did you say opposing or opposing?
Posing.
Yeah, I
I,
think Brits heard you say opposing.
I heard you say
Oh.
opposing.
Oh, no. Fuck, man.
So
Sorry.
to say clearly, to me, this is all about a molecular revolution and molecular accelerationist. Yes, sure, for sure. I have a tough time reconciling accelerationism as being anything but the meta molar grand social movement because that's the vast majority of the writings. There are people who disagree. I I'm very much in the. This is about personally getting yourself to the place where you've deterritorialized yourself, where you have gotten rid of the fascist yourself, where you've embraced change and being and shifting, and you're able to understand the emergent nature of your own existence and embrace that rather than
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
determinant representations.
But in your framing, you're missing. I think the golden middle, or however you call it, and that is that I think it's also silly to only focus on the self. So it's kind of like you have to do it in every interaction, not only in the subjective sphere or the
So
or the
yes, so let me qualify slightly because I'm not disagreeing. When I specifically say within oneself, I include all of that. I don't necessarily believe in a centered subject as a thing.
Okay.
The sphere that is Brooks, that you can't tell me where I end and someone begins. But the difference would be voting for Trump in order to speed up America. A little fast for me. That's a little different. But my talks with you, right here, this is every interaction, absolutely, and anything I touch that, in theory, I may be part of, I consider as part of that overall massive desiring machines that somehow has been called me. So I'm with you on that. And so if that version of accelerationism, if anyone has writings on it, I'd love to find it. I've bought a bunch of accelerationist readers and authors, and they all end up in this really weird. Let's see how terrible it can get for marginalized people. Fuck it, who cares? I'm safe because I'm white, sort of mentality, and it bothers me a great deal. So
Yeah, to be honest, if I can make a bit of a confession, maybe what I like the most about accelerationism is the name, to be honest. I think it's such a fun word.
it,
Um
it- well, it is,
and
and it
like
is.
speed.
No, Paul Virillo has some exceptional books on speed and how it's affected us and how it's shifted that I think also built into me the same sort of inkling and angle that I love the concept and I appreciate it. I appreciate the mentality of like things are broken. Like, why am I supporting this? I get it, and I get some level of that, at least intuitively. But very much it misses a lot of the problems because at that point you start becoming someone who has determined what the goal is and you believe you exist and that you're doing something right, and now you're in a place that is not a good place to be as far as desiring machines or representation are concerned. And again, the fact that in Anti-Oedipus they explicitly say nothing has ever been died under its own contradictions, that we can't break the system like that. That's not what it's for. Bostgard says might be obnoxiously technical. Well, we love obnoxiously technical, but important to remember you can accelerate while maintaining speed. This is actually true. Paul Verillo, by the way, underrated author on a lot of his stuff on sort of the acceleration of life. Worth reading. I've loved it personally. It's not for everyone, but I dig it. The ability changing direction, I think, does it. Oh, thank you, Bostgard. Thank you for the physics lesson. I was waiting for Doug. I assumed Doug, Mr. Physics, would say, but speed is ultimately just magnitude. And an object which experiences either a change in magnitude or velocity vector can be said to accelerating. And negative acceleration is also acceleration. That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, so deceleration is also acceleration, and any force that is perpendicular to your line of velocity will deflect it without changing the magnitude of the vector, so it doesn't change your speed. So you can accelerate by rotating or revolving without changing your speed.
If you drive in a circle at like 5 miles an hour, technically you're accelerating.
Yep. Yep.
And again, it's the shifting of things, the playing with that. Yeah.
I also feel like it is a really interesting feeling because you feel like you're being warped, right? And you don't have that when you accelerate in one direction.
Well, it depends on the magnitude. I mean, again, this is the fun part of acceleration. It's all about the magnitude and you as the sort of center of that. I've been in a car and I've been in very, very, very fast cars that you fucking really did feel going straight to the line, accelerating, but turning it all, suddenly you do feel a shift. And I think that feels like actually the point.
This is because the decoding and deterritorialization of flow define the very process of capitalism. That is, in its essence, its tendency, and its external limit. And I think I'm just still a little bit confused about when deterritorialization is, let's say, a sorry if I put it a bit
Please.
But that deterritorialization is basically a some sort of rebellion against capitalism, and when deterritorialization, as here described, is seen as a definition of capitalism. And I know about the deterritorialization and reterritorialization, like the left hand, right hand thing, the combo that it always goes together. But I think what I find difficult to understand is I have a certain image of deterritorialization as a certain undoing or fundamental changing of the like the suffocating limit setting of capitalism. But then a sentence like this says that it's completely part of it again, and that's why I'm sometimes confused how they view deterritorialization.
So let's break apart a couple things there. So the first is we shouldn't presume that they're necessarily like hateful of every part of capitalism. So when they say like capital or they're critiquing it, they're not saying like anything that it is or it does is evil and bad. That's not the setup. It's some people do this with Marx as well, that Marx was like, oh, this is all shit. Fuck all this, whatever. The deterritorialization as it operates within capital and as it functions has to do with literally how the flows of everything play out. We're always in a weird place within capitalism that, how to put it, let me find a specific line that I want to play with. The deterritorialization is the process of freeing desire from established objects and organs. This is the setup that happens. Capitalism plays in this space very specifically. One sec. I'm going to read from Holland. Deleuze and Guattari used deterritorialization, now in the social register, to designate the freeing of labor power from specific means of production, as in the case of English peasants who were banished or freed by the Enclosure Acts from common land when it was enclosed for sheep grazing. Some peasants, of course, would eventually find jobs working at looms in the nascent textile industry, their labor power thereby reattached or reterritorialized onto a new means of production. The process of deterritorialization and reterritorialization accompany the fundamental mechanization of capital, axiomatization. It operates by conjoining deterritorialized resources and appropriating the surplus arising from their reterritorializing conjunction. The original capitalist axiom, for example, conjoined deterritorialized wealth, monetary wealth no longer embodied in landed property, with deterritorialized labor power bereft of any means of subsistence. The axiomatization of these deterritorialized flows linked liquid wealth invested in means of production with free workers with nothing to sell but their labor power. Subsequently, the continuing development of capitalism has axiomatized many other resource flows: knowledge, skills, taste, go to social media and like literally everything, and integrated them into the production process. So what we're talking about very particularly with these flows is the nature of capital is to not give a shit about what labor does or how things are produced or where their value comes from, but instead to deterritorialize the overall flow around that and ultimately reterritorialize it somewhere else or some other place in order to effectively gain surplus and profit from it. This nature you can kind of spot in a shitload of ways. People doing a thing that doesn't necessarily drive a lot of profit suddenly gets completely co-opted. Lo and behold, here it is. Social media is actually a really good example of this. The internet is not far off as well. Art, video games, you name it. You can find a million ways that people and their work is slowly being separated from quite literally their genuine creative process to absolutely reterritorialized as a simplistic, productive-based job. And when I say job, I mean the sort of shit labor, bullshit job workforce that is able to continue to do these things. It puts workers in that very specific spot. This natural thing that is sort of happening underneath it is the deterritorialization they're talking about. So when we're in AO and we're having the same question here, and they say, specifically this section, they localize social and mental alienation on a single line, referring to Lang and Cooper, and tend to consider them as identical by showing how familial agent extends the one into the other. Between the two, however, the relationship is that of an included disjunction. This is because the decoding and the deterritorialization of flows define the very process of capitalism, its essence, its tendency, its external limit. Everything about it, the deterritorialization of flows in general, merges with mental alienation in as much as it includes the reterritorializations that permit it to subsist only as the state of a particular flow, a flow of madness that is defined thus because it is charged with representing whatever escapes axiomatics. As you do things and as you decide not to take part in society, you're maybe doing your thing, but you are immediately reterritorialized as mad and as someone who is non-productive, as someone who doesn't necessarily deserve a chance to live or breathe or have medical care or a house over your head. We do weird shit like that. Literally got in a fight with my father about this last week. Pretty bad one. This play that's happening is what they're talking about very particularly, this included disjunction, the way that capitalism functions at its base. I don't know if that helped at all, but if it didn't, I'm happy to go on or have someone else talk as well.
Yeah, just just a quick clarification question because it does help. But so would the deterritorialization of something like producing art be the fact that it can be sold for money?
Let's talk about specifically producing art. It's a great one. A guy I really like online. I got some statues made. He molds bismuth. It's really fascinating and it's pretty cool. I really like it. These statues. He ended up at some point. Someone noticed and they started talking to him about being able to produce it at length and buying the rights to use his setup. So he had a choice. He chose against it, but he had a choice to basically go, oh, sure, I'll help you factorize this product, automate it, so we can have larger amounts of money. But suddenly, that thing that he's doing is no longer his thing. He's no longer coded as the sculptor or the artist. Now he's been displaced, reterritorialized elsewhere, because once this becomes automated, what does he have? Are there table makers? Sure, they exist. But how many table makers are there? Shoemakers? How many, anything? Computer builders? Used to be a thing once upon a time, not so much anymore. These things sort of shift over time as people have, how to put it, as capitalism sort of breaks down the literal coding of meaning in the process of production or your place within it, it doesn't leave you to disappear and find your own way. That's not really how capital operates. It didn't operate that way with the people who used to just work the fields, and it got shifted to where it was all for livestock, and now they had to find jobs elsewhere. It didn't just go, well, you're out. We now have other excess labor. You can do this other shittier job. Think of it as skilled labor that now has to work in a factory for doing mindless, manufacturing jobs. This shift and this play are things that go back and forth in capitalism, and it's core to it.
But so is in this case deterritorialization from capitalism similar to Marx's alienation from labor? Like, is that kind of what? Because that's
yes. Well, to them, it's and I'll let someone else talk. But to me, my understanding is that they're talking about it part and parcel. That this is where I think it was even what they directly say in the section I was reading, that the deterritorialization of flows in general effectively merges with mental alienation, in as much as it includes the reterritorializations that permit it to subsist only as the state of a flow of madness. This thing to them is part and parcel. Again, the social alienation and mental alienation, as they say, we seek in vain to assign one side or the other, as long as we establish a relation of exclusion between the two. It's like, no, they merge. These are the same thing. The way that we see ourselves in society, the representations it plays, the way that our meaning is sort of deterritorialized and broken down and then reassembled for us. We are reproduced. They say one can find the form of social alienation in action in all the reterritorializations of capitalism, in as much as they keep the flows from escaping the system and maintain labor in the axiomatic framework of property and desire in the applied framework of the family. But this social alienation includes in its turn mental alienation, which finds itself represented or reterritorialized in neurosis, perversion, and psychosis, mental illnesses.
But then, so I really am following you here. But then what I find difficult to combine is how they also use deterritorialization as a force that can respond to capital in a breaking down kind of way. That actually is seen as a radical act from a schizoanalytic viewpoint, because that's also how they use deterritorialization.
I think it's tough for me to make this leap. I've got to jump to logic of sense, where I think a lot of this is a little helped. At some point, I'll have the recordings online. Very specifically, the act of deterritorialization is the breaking down and neutralization of forced meaning and representation, ideas on high. In logic of sense, Deleuze makes a series of arguments that ultimately culminate in a handful of very, very powerful points that are really complicated, and I'm going to overly simplify, and I apologize. But one of his big pushes is this idea of a counter-actualization. The fact that we sort of as a subject or the ego or where we sit and we play, he calls us the phantasm, we sit within that, have the ability to sort of play with how meaning works and are able to break it down in a unique way. We can live in the heights, as he calls them, within ideas. We can live within the bodies, as the schizo or Nietzsche does. But there is a Zen thing in the middle where we're able to sit and observe the bodies, understand the heights and the ideals, and shift how the meaning works. This to me is where he's making the play here and where AO makes the shift, where it's, look, capitalism's doing this, but it's doing it within representation. It's not, it's deterritorializing, but it's also immediately re-territorializing. This is the other part. It's not just deterritorializing and letting people be free to do whatever they're doing. Immediately upon losing your job because a factory closed, or Tesla came in, or Walmart came in and they had to close all the little stores in your town, capitalism doesn't just let you be. Suddenly you are now indigent, or you need a job. Around private property, we immediately re-territorialize you as a wage slave, effectively. You once were a business owner, maybe had your own place, Walmart ran you out. You've been deterritorialized, then immediately re-territorialized in relation to both the generalized axiomatic of the family, but also private property. The deterritorialization of the subject, or the deterritorialization that he's referring to sort of as part of that permanent revolution and within schizoanalysis, is not a re-territorialization. He doesn't say, oh, good, you find, as the paragraph ends, he doesn't go, you don't find a new island, happy day. In fact, I think he literally makes a comment sort of laughing about that. 1 second. Here, that is what the completion of the process is. Not a promised and a pre-existing land, but a world created in the process of its tendency, its coming undone, its deterritorialization. It's not a re-territorialization that gives you the place, but it is the deterritorialization itself that gives you a land that in the process of itself is the thing that you're going to find another one. And you, just by being there, it's not that it's ever fully defined.
And that's becoming then. That's becoming.
Correct.
Huh?
Correct.
Yes. Oh, I get it. Yes.
So capitalism fucks the process up by basically re-territorializing us in relation to personal private property, plus a whole shitload of representations and axiomatics that we kind of are built with. We need to work within ourselves. I do believe it is that. When I say ourselves, I do mean the decentered subject, but we need to make efforts to just a general deterritorialization as we move. And by being so and being in the point of being, that shifts us, and immediately we become just different. And yeah, they would never say, you'd never say that someone who's achieved that level would ever be, they're in a specific place they can't get out of, they've been re-territorialized. It's like, no, they're going, they're just going, and they're allowed to.
Okay, this is great, Brooks. Thank you. This is really good. I'll leave space for someone else, but I do have a question later down the line.
Excellent. I want to get to Tiernan, who typed so very much. I might be naive of accelerationism, but I feel they often forget deterritorialization is multiple and spatiotemporal, since capitalism necessarily deterritorializes and re-territorializes. What's imperative is provoking the specific deterritorialization, which are politically advantageous. 2 examples. Non-binary was a deterritorialization of gender determination. What's getting axiomatized by capital currently, it's still a deterritorialization that is politically advantageous. It produces new subjectivities that open up new possibilities. On the other hand, the rise of multinational corporation is a movement of deterritorialization. NAFTA is a government re-territorialization of this. Tiernan is continuing what I was a great point. It's the point. It's about the deterritorialization, not the re. It's spending time there and just allowing that that process of becoming to be the land that is created in the process of itself. The re-territorialization that happens, especially due to capital and representation, is the problem. So it's kind of, I think at one point they said one hand deterritorializes, the other re-territorializes. They then go on to say, by the way, it doesn't have to be that way a little bit. And so it gets a little confusing. That's how I interpret that anyway. I'm open to anyone wanting to respond, by the way. But good point, Tiernan.
Question about Lacan.
Sorry, JK, a little louder.
Yeah, I have a question about Lacan. When he talks about Lacan, is he saying that Lacan is distinct from the Freudian psychoanalysis because he's created a new structure that does not rely on the Oedipal image? of and but there is a stage of where there is castration and there is the lack, right. So there is those elements. But is he saying that Lacan is free from this kind of um, you know representation? Um, that
I
he's
think the phrasing he particularly uses is that Lacan believes in the right to nonsense. I think is the phrase he uses, and the absence of a link. Here it is. You will not have reached the ultimate and irreducible terms of the unconscious so long as you find or restore a link between two elements. And this is sort of this practical rule laid down by Leclerc following Lacan. This thing that he's playing with, I think it's their overall critique. It's like, yeah, here's the good stuff, but you just didn't go far enough. You blew up the 4 pylons and the statue in place landed right where it was. You did some damage, but it didn't change anything. Because ultimately, again, the demand of signifiers and master signifiers and all sorts of things goes very much against a lot of the rest of what they say. But again, they're not like throwing out the baby with the bathwater with any of these people. They very much want to take pieces from this and pieces of that, and it's why I say that they're not pro-capitalist at all. They're not accelerationist in the Landian sense, but it's not a everything sucks, burn it all down. It's a hey, there's things to learn from all of this, and just as with the schizophrenic that they use as a tool for us to begin to understand how the unconscious operates, utilizing capitalism and capital as a way to understand how the social operates is not a wild stretch.
Yeah, and I think, well, first of all, I just plugged in a new microphone, so let me know if the volume's way off. But
It's way better. You sound way better.
Yeah, you sound really good.
Yeti Blue, thank you. But yeah, so I think we can take all the discussion of deterritorialization we were just having to help us understand this political point, because I think there's a lot of ways to look at deterritorialization, but one of the common threads through it all for me is that it's a form of movement through sort of creative destruction. And so the fact that there is really a destructive element in deterritorialization, which I think for them is basically all movement and change, means you do have to be very cautious. And that's why you don't want to deterritorialize too fast. You don't want to destroy too much too fast.
Yeah, they even say the line, I think, is because we're talking mostly here about the destructive tasks. We haven't gotten to the positive tasks of schizoanalysis. I'm going to avoid talking about them heavily here because it's going to cost a million things. But I think they open by saying quite cleanly, you need to be swift but careful, I think is how they phrase it, where you do have to dive right in and you've got to immediately sort of nip it in the bud, but you can't just do it recklessly. It's got to be very carefully done. A lot of this, again, to go to logic of sense and Deleuze's use of counteractualizations feels very on point. I don't know if anyone from our logic of sense group would agree or disagree, but there's a lot of sort of playing with that they're very much, it feels like Deleuze is very much going at here for the most part. So it's thoughtful, but you got to hit someone quick. Yeah, I'll find that and I'll send it. But yeah, they make that comment at some point, I think twice actually. Kedis says, Anti-Oedipus criticizes psychoanalysis for making the subject submissive by analyzing it in terms of the Oedipal triangle. Of course, in a sense, this is the aim of psychoanalysis. What would the aim of schizoanalysis be? Can we say that there is a practical side for the application? What would the most practical part of it be? A lot of that is going to be getting into the next two. I would say for this part and this early section, the destructive task, as they call it, it is to move away from representational thinking and determinant thinking, and instead break down why a person, why their representations work as they do and how they operate, rather than letting them sit there and beginning to pretend that we have a I don't know if that makes sense, Kedis. The positive tasks are more difficult. and we will be doing another one here. So I'll refer back to you. I'll ping you when we start to answer that question at some point.
I have another thing.
Of course you do.
A little bit building on what we were talking about earlier. So you were saying a bit like how in capitalism, after deterritorialization, you immediately get reterritorialized, and you give an example of, I don't know, someone who was doing some manual labor that gets, industrialized, and then they don't, they sort of get forced to find another meaning within society. So that means they have to get a job at a factory, for example.
Mhm.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Doug. I'll turn up. But my question was, in a way, so Keynes, for example, famous economist, but also someone like Oscar Wilde, but maybe Keynes is a better example, talked about this dream of capitalism where once these things get deterritorialized, people will become free, right? Like
Mhm.
people could focus on, for example, self-cultivation is one of the examples given of what people could do after basically having been made obsolete by industrialization. And I do think there's this such a beautiful image of when you're obsolete, you are sort of ultimately free or something. But it often regarded as like the Keynes is often regarded as being very naive on that part. And I just wonder how basically Deleuze and Guattari's proposal for deterritorialization differs from how Keynes posed it, as like saying, hey, if you don't need to work the fields anymore, you can just like, hang out, relax, make art.
I think I would say the difference would be in that first part of it. If you don't need to work the fields anymore, you can relax, make art. And I think there's a tweet I saw a little bit ago that I think encapsulates a little bit of my feeling towards it, which is if it turns out that someone wants to just be born and then do random shit until the day they die because they like it, I'm okay with that. That, I think, puts us in a different place than Keynes, which is this I think fairly naive belief that we can get to a point in capital that everything's taken care of and we certainly aren't going to continue to exploit labor, when the reality is anyone who's not blind knows that labor is the only thing that allows us to drive excess profit, and D&G are very crisp about that too. The challenge being that we will always find a way to shit on all of the working class and put them in a place. So that's where that naivete comes. I think for this, we're talking about very much like people do their thing naturally. Where do they connect? How do they connect with things? What do they do? And how do they play with it? Instead of saying, well, if we can, as a society, if we can survive it and we can keep our city squares clean and we can have no crime and all of us can have a decent living. Now, by decent living, we all have different, like, that's the Keynes vision. Puts us in a place of, again, I would say a yoke and it's a carrot at the end of a stick, a very long fucking stick. That is where the naivete comes. This is much more just stepping aside of that and saying, let people live. If that makes sense, Misha.
Yeah, it does. It's just that, I mean, in a way, we have reached sort of that the material conditions for what Keynes was hoping for.
Oh, we have, but at the same time, Doug says every possible choice we could want would be available to a person with enough capital. I don't know if I'd even agree with that. I would say the eunuch that Deleuze and Guattari discuss when they talk about capital, the capitalist eunuch who's ultimately just stuck in between the flows of capital and doesn't have the freedom to do things. His desires are manufactured much, much harder. Oh, you're saying it's Keynes' desire. Yes, their belief is that, like, Jeff Bezos is free. I would disagree with that. I think he controls a great deal and he's more free than fucking most people for sure. But, you know, wealthy people are stuck in their position too. Capitalism manufactures everyone. This isn't a, you know, he's in a position where he's controlling people, and yes, he's a dick and fuck that guy. But what is he going to do? Like, he's been manufactured by it, and everything he does is deterritorialized and reterritorialized. The necessity of everything we do and the play we're making as people and what we decide to do isn't, it's not like Jeff Bezos wakes up and his desiring machines work completely freely. Like, he lives in a place of even, I would suggest, harder representation. Joe Biden, the most powerful person in theory in the world, lives within the worst kind of representational prison that there is. If you've ever watched him, I think he says some things he believes, and he get them, and he just, because he gets fucked. Like, he's an idiot, but what are you going to do? He's got to keep the thing in the machine going. Like, he's got to keep going, and everyone's got to keep the thing going. That's the terrifying part. If there is a great film that gets this across, Snowpiercer, I think the one side people don't really get of it is that it's about how all of us are on this train on a track that is being, you know, supported by children who are being murdered. And we're all just going in one direction, and none of us stop it because we're all scared that we would die. And that, I think, is not a terrible allegory for generally how people feel within all of this. If we stop it, what are we going to do? Like, what do we do tomorrow? Like, everything's fucked. And that's the fear. And that's the thing that keeps them moving. It keeps us going. It keeps capital flowing. It's very good at it. The way representation plays into all of that. And that alienation that they discuss in here. It keeps us all going. And so, yeah, that's why I tend to, with the Keynes thing or any of it, I tend to always just sort of, I don't believe anyone in capital can be free. And that includes the wealthy.
That's why the US should invade Ukraine instead of Russia, to be faster.
We should accelerate. We should join forces with Russia to invade the Ukraine.
Yes.
Yes. It's all of it is just sort of this weird play of, like, we do have to be careful how we mean freedom, Jack, but I'm more speaking just general colloquialism. But I would even say the wealthy, like, when they're more free, they have more choices, they have more options. Their desiring machines are not operating them. They're stuck within representation. To me, representation is a prison. That's how I interpret it. Desiring machines are, and their natural emergent behaviors and mine are freedom. That's how I view it. Feel free, Jack, jump in. Come on. You haven't talked. Jump in.
Jumping on the subject of freedom, I feel like Patrick Swayze in Roadhouse.
Roadhouse.
Yeah, you know that scene where the nurse is fixing him up from his stab wound bouncing. It's like, oh, I see you studied philosophy. He's like, yeah, back in college I majored and I got a bachelor's. Like, what'd you focus on? Oh, you know, nothing serious, just the meaning of life and that shit. One of my favorite scenes in the movie. That's the only good scene, but yeah, I guess, like, to risk being Patrick Swayze than jumping in on freedom, I suppose. I would say you got to be very careful how you place freedom, because especially in the US, you know, we usually think of freedom in terms of freedom from things. This idea of, like, an unfettered liberation into something unconditioned, right? An unconditioned freedom. And I don't know that that's the kind of freedom to losing water you have in mind.
I can agree with that. It's also not the freedom as I intended it either. Because it's the libertarian, it's not a positive freedom, a freedom to actively do whatever, but instead of no one's stopping me because I have so much power kind of mentality. But it doesn't involve the implied restrictions on any sort of behavior that come with that. There's a lot of challenges there. It's fair.
Yeah, how about the freedom to be just present, right?
Y-
And instead of
yeah,
instead of being controlled by these representations, right? Where you're always, driven by some goal or right in the future.
yeah. It's there's a great line I love. It's existential comics. I bought it as a shirt for my son when he was a baby. It's an adult man talking to a little girl, and he goes, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And she goes, "I want to be an honest and good, caring person." He says, "No, no, no. How do you want to sell your labor?" And I think that's it feels like the same kind of point, the demand that you become useful. Uh, and I go with the old story of the Taoist sage walking down the street. Ben, I think, would be proud that I'm bringing up in this reading. But Taoist sage walking down the street with a student who sees a tree that's gnarled and awful, and he goes, "Look at that ugly tree." And he goes, "Yes, but that tree, it's been there for my entire life. Probably will be there for yours." He's like, "Yes, but it's gnarled and ugly." He goes, "That's the reason it hasn't been cut down." it's it's the ability to be useless is something we underestimate very much. Sorry, Jack. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I always get tricked in making sense. It's fucking lame.
I thought I was the one with the bad jokes. Uh, no, I appreciated all those. That made me chuckle. Um, no, I guess continue on the point of freedom, though. I mean, this is always a challenge with like post-structuralist ethics because coming out of its existentialism and even Marxism, for that matter, right? We're looking for the subject, the transcendence of the ego, right? The stemming of the meaningful subject and the meaning of life in that manner, uh, right? And now I've gone full Patrick Swayze. Uh, but this is, I think, part of the challenge that the post-structuralists leave us. And certainly the challenge of the ethics in Anti-Oedipus, right, is if we are caught in the tension of the I believe versus the production, right, kind of where they started in the beginning of the section, the tension of the representation of the unconscious, representation of production as I believe, I am, I think, whatever you like, the preconscious versus the unconscious process of production, then that would seem to me to be, and this is kind of a brick alert point, but that would seem to me to be the conditions of any freedom, right? I think this is why they go to Proust and Chaplin, and they do this so interestingly, right? Because they focus on, it's not just Proust, it's Proust's narrator, right? This is kind of experimentality of those pieces. It's not simply Chaplin, it's Chaplin in this movie, since I don't believe the character has a name. But there's something about what they're doing, right, to representation as much as in the creation of a line of escape or a line of flight that I think does get at the ethical task, right? That is where any sense of freedom um, is made possible and makes different things possible. That's why I think there can be this destructive task and these positive tasks.
Very much agree with that. One sec, Doug. I want to get Kedis's question in, then we can do it. Kedis asks, can we say that schizoanalysis is a method of emancipation for the political subject? How much is it philosophical, psychological, scientific, religious, if it is at all? Doug, I know Doug said he's got a line there. I think, is it Doug? You said you got a note, which we can, if you want to jump in, go for it.
Yeah. Yeah. So first of all, I thought that was a really good question. It's kind of an obvious one to ask on its face, but I think if you like look at it, it's actually a pretty deep one. Yeah. So first, just is this emancipation? Is that an actual end that they are putting in? And I think they are. I think that's especially as we read the last two sections, that will become pretty evident. And is it a method of emancipation? I think that is a deep question because, it gets at the play between means and ends. And schizoanalysis certainly seems to be a means of a sort, but the end or the limit that's trying to be surpassed is they're trying to package it in there somehow, right? Have it be kind of just an unconscious investment at the start that will play out with just a flick of the finger. And so I don't have a definitive answer except to say that I think it is a tricky question that requires thinking about the complication of all those issues.
Very much. I think the very easy answer, and there's a lot of caveats, but they're not worth really going into, would be to just say yes. And how much is it any of those things? It's all of those things. It's a complete and total shifting of how representation, myth, legend, stories, familial relations, social relations, beliefs, all of those things. How our delusion, our collective, how these things work together and the destruction of them. I would say yes. There's caveats to a lot of that, so don't just go quoting me. But yeah, I think generally yes.
I suppose to try and get at the question and both to question the question and work toward an answer. Again, it's this question of like, how are we understanding freedom or emancipation? At least for me, that's where I think things were coming off Sartre's heels, right? That's even part of the big thing of like existentialism as humanism is, right? Is arguing existentialism as a condition of freedom, right? And you can kind of see how that, it's certainly not D&G's point, but those concerns have some parallel in the projects, even though they're very different in how they're built out. But, the question of the conditions of freedom and what can freedom condition. I would say in that sense, right, the political subject's always a product and particularly, right, at the conjunct, and then there's the question of the territory, right, or the zone between the second and third syntheses. So I would say this is where the deterritorialization comes in. In that sense, I don't know that it's about the subject unless we qualify it as the unconscious, because in this sense, the deterritorialization is a shifting of what is upon the socius, and thereby a falling back on production that is itself a shift, right? So new zones, new subjectivities, and to qualify the new here, the novelty of it, part of what makes it new is, right, there's a way of understanding the socius as producing difference and all that. But there's something going on with the revolutionary investment that in shifting production, right, some of the things it does is it shifts the zones of the subject, right, where it will come to take place. And it's going to shift, and this is kind of where they do that subject-subjugated group thing. It's going to shift the actual collectivity of it all, more so that like first synthesis. So in that sense, like it's not just the nuance of it being something new, or in that sense, something new and therefore free. I think it's getting at this point at which that which is produced following this line of escape is kind of like, and here, since we're in the destructive task, we're going to see again like Proust narrator and Chaplin. They're destroying representations, but they're opening up all these new different ways in which capacities and distributions can take place, and indeed will take place by way of this this investment that's been created. Even though, it's not to say that reactionary investments won't follow, but it's to say that the index is at least being modified.
Hello.
Please.
Uh,
Hello, Case.
If you can hear me right, I would like to jump in just
Please.
for some remark. I in the question, I think when I ask is schizoanalysis an emancipatory means towards emancipating the subject, I mean in the most political sense. My second question, I think, is somehow related to the first one. I don't want to jump into the details of the relation with psychoanalysis, but I wanted to grip on the fundamentals of the relation between schizoanalysis and psychoanalysis. From my point of view, which I'm more familiar with psychoanalysis than schizoanalysis, just more familiar, I mean. Psychoanalysis tries to work with a subject in which, in the case of psychoanalysis, it is analyzed subject, is the subject of a single person, of a single individual, and it works with the subject to give him the possibilities to work with what it lacks. And I'm using the word lack because lack is for many psychoanalysts is the crucial point of the desire. And this is a point where Deleuze and Guattari criticize psychoanalysis because they see desire not as an object caused by the luck, but they see it in a positive way. They see desire as production in some sense. I'm not sure if I'm right here, but I'm going to talk this out because I want to explain about the question. And in psychoanalysis, people go there to get better with what they're dealing. I mean, they go there to get better with their problems, with what they fundamentally lack. And this is only the part of psychoanalysis. And from what we read in this chapter, because I mostly was part of this finished chapter, I saw that schizoanalysis doesn't focus on what the subject lacks. It focuses. I don't know if it focuses, but it goes beyond the lack of the subject. It sees the desire as something produced, and there where the psychoanalytic subject is somehow not. I would say this, that for the subject which schizoanalysis is talking, the psychoanalytic practice would make the subject weak. That is why I am asking about what kind or what type of subject schizoanalysis is talking about, because I don't think it is psychoanalytic subject. I mean, nobody goes in schizoanalysis to deal with his personal problems and to deal with with what he is fundamentally lacking. And so I go on to the second question, because I know that from what I was saying till now, I know that psychoanalysis no, I know that schizoanalysis doesn't deal with psychoanalytic subjects, but so I raised the second question. Does it deal with political subjects? And if it deals with political subjects, it is a means of it is a means to emancipate a subject. I didn't mean anything special about emancipation. Emancipation for the subject in my question means only that the subject we're talking about is political.
Well,
If it is, yeah.
To respond there, I mean, using emancipation does bring in this language, and that's okay. I'm not saying there is no freedom. I'm saying we have to be careful about how we're understanding freedom. And certainly, I would agree there is a political context. So, insofar as the freedom extends in that political context, that becomes important there too, right? At least in the U.S., I see this in the discourse all the time. Is freedom is understood to be a freedom from something oppressive, whereby there's this strange turn of the screw where it's actually to be in a certain way oppressed by it. It's a very interesting usage there. But to get at the first part of your question in terms of the subject, that's why I say it's understanding and qualifying the subject as the unconscious, because to follow, I think, this aspect of the connective in terms of things joining and disjoining, right? Connecting and breaking flows and machines. I would say that that is going to be your subject, and that the way the syntheses construct that that thing, right? There's a good technical term for you, that thing. That is the subject, and I believe that's how they kick off this section, even is pointing that out. Whereas, kind of like you're saying in psychoanalysis, the traditional move is to take the person, and it's usually by way of the ego, if we keep this in psychoanalytical language, taking the ego to kind of access some of the unconscious and working with it in that manner in terms of the personal. At some level, this actually, since Dingo or Brenton you've joined, this is actually getting at the difference between the psychotic and the neurotic, I think, is the in a more classical sense. But yeah, to answer your question, Kadis, I would say it's the unconscious as subject versus the unconscious in its representation that psychoanalysis usually treats it by.
I would also say I'm more hesitant to say that there is direct political, like the use of political also has issues, because there is, and they're explicit in this, there is no strictly political program for schizoanalysis. It is the political reformations that may come of it are not, it's not like a goal. They don't believe in goals. Don't do that. Representational thinking. I would be hesitant also to say that it's not the psychoanalytic subject that they're talking about, not in the same sense as Lacan may refer to it, but when I've used the term analyst and analysand, Guattari doesn't shy away from this language pretty regularly when he's referring to this or he's writing about it as well. Whether we call that thing or essence or whatever it is at the other end, the political subject or whatever it may be, there is ultimately underneath it the idea of how we can work with people. So people who are living, breathing collectives of whatever they are able to move away from these molar aggregate representations and instead live a more vitalistic, emergent life.
I think maybe the question is not just general, but it's somehow fundamental. we may change our minds during the reading of this book anytime, and somehow asking such questions, answering some such questions is measuring what we know about this. I will tell you something from my experience being in such a short time with this group for this section we are reviewing right now. When I read the pages, it seems to me because I read What is Philosophy from Deleuze-Guattari, but I didn't read anything else, I think, and this was somehow a reintroduction to me to Deleuze-Guattari. And when I read the pages, I understand something different from what I hear you discussing with one another. And from my perspective, I see that you're talking about, as a group, I mean, you're talking about a structure which maybe you developed while reading, and from what I understand from from the words you use, I see that I understand that schizoanalysis, or the content of this critical book, is sometimes scientific, sometimes philosophical. It deals with sometimes with a critique in psychoanalysis. Sometimes I get the feeling it kind of deals with ideological issues. I wrote just for contrast religious, but I don't think they're religious. But understanding how much each of these aspects is part of Anti-Oedipus is somehow understanding the text in general. And I know we need to read it till the end to understand it, but somehow these questions, or this question maybe, is what repeats itself for me, I mean, every time or many times when we discuss about the book. And when I turn to the text, I don't see much of what we usually say in our discussions. I don't know if it's a matter of they use many new concepts, and you have to understand. But from the examples you give, I think most issues are clear.
I don't know if this is me, but
Examples
You're
are really clear.
you're coming through like super.
With
It's
all
you're starting to
these
turn
fields.
into a robot. You're starting to turn into a robot. I can't really hear you. There's a connection thing, I think. All right, are you able to hear us? Okay.
I have a poor connection.
To say sort of what I was getting there.
Have a poor connection.
When
Do I? Yeah.
so
Do you hear me now?
yes.
Just to close the sentence, from what you even if the question repeats itself during the course of the reading, it's somehow the time necessary to create the concept. That's why this question brings itself up in my case. Your explanations and your discussions and the examples you give, I think, explain and
I think we lost.
relation.
Oh,
Well,
there you are.
Frick, you were about to say the most
You were
important
about
part
to
of the
say you were
sentence.
getting to the end.
Experience with the group.
I can't tell if it's a critique that we are using explanations that aren't directly from the book or if it's helping. Am I alone in that?
I think helping me at least.
It's hard to tell if it. I hope we're helping.
It was a critique. It was. Mm-hmm.
I hope it's helpful. It's genuinely one of the things, and Doug will say, from my perspective, hearing more and different readings is only a plus. 100%, like beyond helpful. It's incredibly important. It's why I like various videos that I don't necessarily 100% get or agree with, but then I go back and I reread why I believed what I did, and I go, oh, there's actually a point in this. It kind of tends to be the thing. So much of what you'll hear me say today, if you want, you can go back. You can literally hear our recapitulation of 4.3 about a year and I want to say 4 months ago now. Jesus Christ, really? Yep, near 4 months ago. Jesus. And it is not this one. And come back in a year and 4 months when we do AO again and we get to this point. And it'll probably change again. There's a beauty to a lot of Deleuze's works, I believe, that lend themselves, Guattari too, to multiple readings and a lot of understanding. So I always appreciate anyone saying, "Oh no, what about this?" or disagreeing, like because I have my take, but it's one that has evolved thanks to mostly actually people on the server, to be frank. So yeah, I hope our interpretation generally helps. Because it is a lot of this shit is really complicated, needlessly almost.
He makes the distinction between, like schizoanalysis and psychoanalysis, and he uses the word artificial to describe some of the representations that are, in psychoanalysis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I meant by, maybe kind of like describing schizoanalysis as sort of a natural product or a desiring production. But would that describe this notion of emancipation when the schizoid is naturally desiring production and as an individual and in terms of the socius.
So I'm really quick going to say, because I'm sure Jack is going to want to jump in here. I don't have a disagreement with using the term natural, as I know you're using it, because we just did a reading of Logic of Sense and literally talked about what this means and the essence of this. If there is the problem with the word, and I think I don't want to put words in Jack's mouth, but it's the one edge, is that very often people, when they say natural, they mean the way it ought to be, like kind of thing. There's like an edge to it of like, look, it's only natural that someone does blah blah blah, and that's a appeal to good and common sense. I don't think you're using it in that way, but the word itself has like weird baggage underneath it. Is that close, Jack?
Well, I mean, there's the logic of sense usage, and then it's how they start off this section, right? Social production, desiring production, right, are processes of production. So right there, anything that would be qualified as natural has to be qualified under the conditions of, the three syntheses, right, or at least the socius and the BWL. So as long as we're using the word in that way, I'm okay with it. the thing I'm concerned about is if we say natural, we're moving toward something unconditioned, right? Something that's not adulterated. And that's where I'm more concerned, is that we're suggesting that there's some sort of something unencumbered, something somehow like unadulterated, pure.
I'm hesitant because to me, I don't, that was almost a presumption of like a Platonic ideal of the natural thing. To me, natural just means organically emergent of its own existence, sort of thing. When I use the term, I get, like I said, there's weird word. It's a weird word because it has a lot of connotations around a lot of those things.
So could you describe the schizo as being in a state of becoming, as opposed to being of artificial representations?
Well,
'Cause
I mean,
he, because he does use
becoming's
the word artificial. Yeah, he does use the word artificial.
right, and they're moving toward, like, for instance, the simulacra, right? The push to the simulacra pushes the simulacra to a point where they cease speaking artificial images to become indices of the new world, right? So again, to like a deterritorialization where the conjunct. It's actually an interesting idea about simulation going on there. But anyways, I lost my train of thought. So the point about becoming, right? That was the question, I think. For me, it's the same thing with the natural as any becoming, and this is the point about the freedom. In the same vein, the social production of a becoming and the desiring production of a becoming have to be taken hand in hand. So like this is where the schizophrenic and like the body without organs, there's the aspect of the socius that has its limit of capitalism, insofar as we're talking about the socius as capital. And I do think there's becomings there, interestingly enough, because we have decoding and deterritorialization. We have all these different things being broken down. They use McLuhan and they talk about electricity, for instance, right? And they qualify that with Yashmelv. I'm not
Yom
getting
Slab.
corrected. There it is. Okay, thank you. They
God,
qualify
it's
that with
been years.
plasmatics. But it's never, see, the memory remains for all you Metallica fans. But yeah, the becoming is contingent there, just like they have to qualify that with the BWO, the creation of the line of escape. That has an effect on this limit that we're talking about. And that to me is it's almost like the Artaud line about the new revelations of being, right? But there's something different about the being there that I think we do well to dwell on this difference of it's basically the difference of conditions and like the difference of the plane, if you like, the socius versus the BWO. But there's something to be considered there in terms of the becomings that each opens up and the way that that's the interesting thing about the escape, right? The way the tension can be released into different becomings. But that's my perspective on it.
I think one of the questions that posed by Kiedis was that psychoanalysis, deals with the problem of desire, right? And but and I think he was asking, whether that was a more kind of like reasonable kind of way to understand the subject, having to do with desire, and as opposed to the schizoanalysis. That also, but supposedly the schizoanalysis has no problem with desire and production and social production, right? Because it's, and it's the psychoanalytic subject that has this problem with desire, right?
Yeah, I think that's correct, right? They open up this section by saying, um, they basically say, right, psychoanalysis makes it a problem of the I believe. So this is the point about understanding the representation of what it does, right? It
But
comes to bear on
specifically,
desire.
just real quick, it's specifically beliefs that are not produced. Like I just want to say, like it's that it is an unconscious that doesn't produce, but does believe. There's a very specific line that's a break there, because and I don't want to get into why. Like I can get into why, but like it's a particular thing. Sorry, Jack. Go ahead.
Oh, no problem. I'm about to, because I know you want to respond to Kedis there, so I'll turn it over to you shortly. But yeah, just to finish the thought, I mean, that's part of what psychoanalysis is doing too, is it's an application of the representation, right? One that is contingent on social production. Yeah, that's kind of the interesting thing about it. But yeah, I mean, to your point, it's the difference in working with desire in the way that schizoanalysis does, which is going to be the three syntheses, right? And then the vitalism and the machinism, the way that all comes together to give you what I guess we can term an assemblage, because otherwise we don't really have a nice catch-all, versus the representation of the unconscious in terms of the I believe, right? Which again invokes, like an ego. So it kind of puts it in an aspect of the neurotic. But yeah, go ahead, Brooks. I think Kedis had a question as well.
How should one read Anti-Oedipus as a critique on capitalism? So I'll do my best, because this is a complex answer. I think it is not just a critique on capitalism. It is a critique on representation. Capitalism and schizophrenia happen to be two lenses that they're utilizing to look at how production works at the molecular and the molar. The way that production works is very interesting. My wife we haven't had my daughter's due Monday. By the way, I probably won't be doing a reading next Monday. So my wife needs the house. I hire a bunch of people to clean my house, and my wife comes back and I'm like, look, I cleaned the house, and I take credit for that. It's this really strange thing I've done. I've usurped other people's production for myself. We would call me a fraud. But capitalism does this really interesting thing where we pretend and we act as if capital, dollars, is actually the thing that produces. Watch Fox News, watch CNBC, talk about job creators, talk about how capital itself actually is what creates production rather than the other way around. And this is ultimately Marx's critique of it, that actually production produces capital. How silly that you would think this thing that does nothing, this abstract thing, but it does. And instead of throwing everything out, we should analyze why, because through that lens, we can also look at schizophrenia, because you and I and all of us do also this really weird thing where I take credit. My ego takes credit for all the desires and choices and things that Brooks has done in his silly life. Good, bad, whatever it may be. Anxiety filled because I did terrible things. Proud of myself, bragging because I did good things, or whatever it may be. I pretend I exist. I take credit for all the production that ultimately made me and produced me, even though I came after. Capital does the same thing. This critique isn't necessarily on capitalism. It's a critique of the nature of desiring production. And they say it very clearly here. Ultimately, everything, all production at once, is desiring and social production. It is not just capitalism that they're going after. They're specifically going after the way that production is co-opted by quasi-causes, by the thing they produce. And in the social world, that's capital and representation, to be frank. And in the desiring production world, it's also representation. And so this large-scale critique of how capital, by taking its place and utilizing pieces of sociuses that came before it, throwing a piece away here, another piece here, other contingent events like the creation of the Urstadt, the nature of the landed gentry, all of these things. It changed how our genuine desires were molded in a social setting, and everything then gets done through the representation of capital. And that very particular thing that then takes credit for all the production I do, but then I take credit for all the production that I do on the desiring machines are sitting ultimately at the base of it all. The labor at the bottom of the production, very, very frustrated that I take credit for everything. This is the overall critique. capitalism being the social and schizophrenia being the molecular. If anyone disagrees, that's genuinely, I think, a decent answer to that. So feel free to disagree. But that's, I think, how I would put it. Again, it's you shouldn't read Marx saying that capitalism is pure evil and it's the whole thing sucks. It's a machine. There's parts of all of these things we can learn from. We can learn from a schizophrenic. Don't go be a fucking schizophrenic. Don't go be a capitalist. But take a look at it and go, wait, how does this work? How are these pieces? What are the machines that make this work? In the same way that we should be checking what machines make us work, what produced us, what are the things, not the representations that we're ascribing to, that I'm a white middle-class man from middle America, but instead a gigantic play towards what are the machines that have done that and the representations foisted on me. The same to a schizophrenic. What is the thing that allows them that production and produces them? What is the thing that makes capital? And let's break them apart, and maybe we can rearrange a few pieces. Maybe we can see how things really work by really deconstructing them properly with desiring machines at the bottom.
So what is the origin of capitalism? Does this go back to this Erstadt and the despot? I mean,
Specifically, the moment capital became a thing, because it's always haunted, as they say, it's always haunted. Capital became a thing very particularly with printed money and the written word. The transition of humanity from, once upon a time we would maybe have art or anything like that, but we ended up with the written word at some point, which changed rather than us seeing a symbol and thinking of water. We now think of the word water when I say the word water, which means we're now a step removed. And this sort of representational nature shifts. The big change, of course, being that you get paid 5 shillings or 5 pennies or $5, and that dollar, which is printed and has the mark of things on it and is written and seen, is not only a representation, but a written one from on high, with essentially the voice of the despot buried deeply inside of it. No longer the despot on high, where I can even pretend that I do things for Daddy Trump or Daddy Biden or Brandon or whatever you want to call him. But the thing I do things for is now through capital and for capital, because capital controls. And it ultimately runs where my alliances are set, where my affiliative reign is set. I no longer have the complex social network behind everything. Everything runs infinitely through capital. And that's the change. If it's one of the things I like about D&G and has always pulled me to them after I finally grasped it during our first reading, and someone really sat me down for like 4 hours and explained it. It's on recordings. It's embarrassing for me, but it probably helps someone. This is not a, capitalism is when money. Capitalism is when rich, which is the silly sort of version a lot of leftists run with. It's, look, there's a function. Capitalism very particularly utilizes private capital and capital as a public thing to assess and decode everything you're doing and to recode it as capital and value in particular ways. This is the function that makes the system what it is. It is the thing that sets it apart from any semblance of what we might call socialism, communism, or other things. And so when we start talking about, is it money? It's like, nah, sort of. It doesn't get the whole thing, because as long as I am a slave to any semblance of representation, God, country, capital, I am not free. And none of us are free. There is no freedom that can be said within anything like that. Instead, we need to do what we can to break all this down, and we need to break away from it and instead separate ourselves from the way that our desire is manufactured through this. That's the difference. It isn't ascribing to Mother Russia because Mother Russia was communist because it said money was bad at one point or another.
I'm an expert in enslavement at the same time in emancipation from past drudgery and poverty, right? So this the notion of enslavement goes back to goes back in history, right, to the master slave mentality and so forth, and the despot, right?
Hmm. Very much.
So
And
so
well,
here,
even before that, the eye of cruelty that they speak about in this chapter goes back, as Bataille and others talked about, um, the way that roles were literally carved in the theater of cruelty. As we watched, the primitive man is the term they use. I hate using that, but a lot of old indigenous cultures often, once a boy or a girl was old enough, they would carve literally into their skin what their role was, scarifying them brutally in some ways, tattooing them, doing horrifying things, literally carving into the body, and they inscribing in the body as they put it. They don't use that term out of nowhere. What your role is, so you know what your relationship is to the alliant and the filiative. You know what you are meant to do, and it is not a free place to be. It is a brutal place of horrifying slavery into that specific role and everything, or you are flatly thrown out of society. You don't have room to play. The hunter doesn't get to eat his meat. The farmer doesn't get to eat his crops. Everything is done for your place inside of it, and they are brutal about that. This is the sort of origin of all of it. But as we start moving beyond that, and we're taught words, and we move from this brutality being a thing that is something literally inscribed to something that is instead spoken, to the theater of cruelty that we take part in fairly every day as people don't do what we quite want in society. And you end up having a screaming match with your father as you walk around your driveway saying, why should people be forced to die because they can't find work? The theater of cruelty that accepts this because they're not doing their thing. They're not allowing that. It's the same line. It's just for different drives. And so this extends back. We're not talking about a time where once upon a time we were free, or some silly version of, I want to go back to the freedom of being stuck inside of a small, living literally hand to mouth, not knowing if death will appear every corner. I'd rather live in that. It's like, come on, fuck off. Let's keep going. Let's keep building. Sorry for the ramble. It makes me nuts when people do that sort of anarcho-primitive bullshit. Anyway, I hope that answered JK. Like this is a long road to get here. And this is not, again, a thing that sort of sprang up overnight. There is no, today we had capitalism, yesterday we had despotism. These are pieces here and there picked up in different ways that someone else added a thing here, another one added a thing here. Financialized capitalism, I don't think actually even happened without slavery as we understand it. There's a wonderful book, The Half Never Told, about capitalism and slavery in America and the way that the financialized world exists because of the slave trade. And quite literally, chattel human slavery is the reason that we have things like credit default swaps, which is fucked up, but an amazingly well-researched and well-written book. Again, this is not a new thing. Capitalism is not some random piece. These pieces come from places, and they just happen to have this formation.
and that's why capitalism at a certain level is very consistent with democracy and freedom and so forth, right?
Yeah, it works very well because democracy, as much as anyone, and I do believe in the right of people's voting, I'm not anti-democratic, but it's a thing capitalism is able to do because it's the representations that form us cause us to vote certain ways. Like capitalism doesn't mind us, generally speaking, voting for the status quo, which is generally speaking what happens. So there's a hesitance I have to say that like democracy is the opposing element to that. I think there's ways of doing it, but it's definitely an interesting setup. I'm going to link in the thing. It's the book specifically is titled "The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of Modern Capitalism," and it is a horrifying read. That it's one of those things when people say, "Well, capitalism is built on slavery," and everyone's like, "Well, yeah, I know history." It's like, no, you know. Like literally the financial sector in Louisiana literally defined financial capital as we know it today. It's just insane. But it's they're intertwined for sure.
I just have a. I know it's already late and stuff. I just have a bit of a. Yeah. So how you mentioned earlier about the to not reduce the idea of capitalism to money or to let's say what we let's say to the U.S. or something. But how would you through the social through the idea of the socius look at a Stalin-led Soviet Union? Like how would that fit into the capitalist socius and representation?
How did you're talking about Stalinist Russia and how it worked within the same principles?
Yeah. Like, does it still completely fit, or is there something that is maybe slightly different worth looking at?
The realities of the USSR, Jack nailed it. It's produced through the socialists. None of this is like produced counter to that. The prevailing realities of how production worked there still were ultimately set up and organized by capital. Now, how capital worked may be different, how the society worked, but it's the reason that China's very much not a communist state, I guess, but I would very much say that there's money flowing, money determines where people work, and production determines how people work from on high. It may be centrally planned, all of those fun things, but it doesn't drive in a different direction the way that it ultimately manufactures the desires of people.
To tack on to that, it's worth keeping in mind, like, so capitalism is the exterior limit, right? In that sense, it's not getting at the justification of the USSR or any country in terms of identifying an economic system. It is to say that the USSR is produced with the limit of capitalism, right? That exterior limit. So it's not an argument over like, can we categorize it as socialist or capitalist? It's an argument of, and actually, Brooks, when you said like how things are flowing in that, I mean, I think that's a large part of it is the disjunctive synthesis going on there, right? That is the production of the USSR. That is the distribution that takes place.
Yeah, maybe my question is like I totally get that the USSR is produced through that, and also that desire is manufactured, like that the state manufactures that, or that the socialist manufactures the desire of the actors living in the Soviet Union. But my question is mostly like when you talk about capitalism, can you manufacture desire through the socius that is not a capitalist socius?
I'm going to reply and then I'll turn it over to Brutz. I don't think it's the state per se. The point of capitalist socius, right, is that that's not necessarily the state, although it affects whatever the state can and will do, and it makes use of the state in the recoding process, right? So in that sense, it's not, this is kind of a strangeness of it, but it's not Stalin per se that makes the USSR happen, right? It's capital, right? That is more or less that is the socios. So in that sense, right, to get to the second part of your question before I turn it over, this is why section 4.3 and this book will go the way it does, but particularly why it ends, 4.3 ends the way it does in this point of the destructive task is they're not arguing that we need to make a shift to socialism or whatever. They're arguing that we need to use these two tasks to encourage basically a new socius. And that's very challenging to unpack in 5 minutes, but that's kind of the argument in a sense, is that there's a sense in which they're calling for a new socius, what they call a new Earth,
I
a
would,
third deterritorialization.
and again,
ahead.
I go back to what is causing people to want the things they want, and what is causing things to be manufactured and built at a social level. What is taking credit for that? And well, in Soviet Russia, it may have been the state. Ultimately, cash, the ruble, is the thing that really actually ran the overall socius. The example would be simple. Over time in Soviet Russia, the ruble, because everyone kind of got paid the same amount, and everyone kind of had, it was like coupons more than it was like dollars. It was a different thing. They didn't have supply demand curves. People got how much as they got. But the problem is there was a few issues. First off, as more people came to get employed, they had to be paid, but the goods didn't really increase as a thing. They didn't really move stuff up. People also wanted higher quality shit. They were kind of tired of stuff at the base level, if you can aspire that to anything else. But then all of that sort of led to people having excess rubles for work they were doing. They had capital. Like that's what that is. Excess money from being paid for work, and the excess from that is capital. What they did with it, instead of, because they couldn't fund companies or anything, instead the gray and black market took off like nobody's business. The great example I love is cars. If you wanted a car, you'd have to stand in line, basically. There was a queue to buy a new car. But if you had enough of the other stuff, you could buy a used car pretty much any time. And so everyone kind of got into this weird used car business. And this strange sort of secondary market of fixing those cars and then making them fancier. And this gray market that was just sort of organically merged and created out of it ultimately was produced by having excess capital in hand. This setup continued in a lot of different ways. Goods from outside the country, from the West, all sorts of things in this gray and black market. And so as you start, again, playing into what was produced, what was moving around, what was decoded, and what was recoded, within Soviet Russia, it was capital. And we don't call it that necessarily because we have a very specific skewed view of what capital is. But as far as I'm concerned, if you have excess money after labor, and that then scales and changes how production happens, I don't see how that's anything but capital myself.
Let me throw in one more thing before Misha and perhaps someone else responds, because I noticed you used the word manufacture. Before I continue, Cosmic Debris, love the name, love the picture, man. I was listening to Lumpy Gravy earlier. Rock on. But going back to that now, I noticed you used the word manufacture. And this is what I mean about like the unadulterated naturalism. Like, and I'm not trying to be snooty when I do this, but there is something I think to be said here, in that the point of the desiring production and the social production being different than the I believe, right? Than being different than a problem of ideology, a problem with the preconscious, and so on and so forth, is to get at this point that the flows of capital are flows of desire, right? This is why the masses, it's not sufficient to say that they were tricked. It is sufficient to say that they were produced through these desires, and that is what consummated them as real. The masses, that is what consummated the masses as real. For better or worse, however regrettable that is for somebody who wants to take a different approach, fair enough. But Deleuze and Guattari's position is that it's not an artificial desire that produces them. It is social production itself.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating because when you get into how the actual functioning of the USSR worked, I mean, they tried basically a different version of capitalism. The way factories worked, they still made a surplus. Like it's the nature of the beast when you use money the way that they did and production the way they did, even if it's state controlled. So this surplus very often factories would have. and keep. And at some point, they would decide to, within their own, there's a word for it in Russian, I don't know, within their own sort of grouping, they would give that money to the people who have raw resources to build houses and housing. And so the factories that had surplus built better housing because they had more of it for their employees. And so people would want to work at those companies more. The people didn't own these buildings. The factories did, which in essence the state sort of did. But like that's how these things flowed and how people's lives were determined is still through capital, ultimately.
And again, not trying to be snooty or pedantic about it, but it is a really critical distinction in this book, I think, because at that level, right, that what we're basically talking about here is the molar, and that's really important, right? I mean, the stuff we're talking about here certainly has an exigency, but this is where that destructive task also has its exigency, right? As what's going on in the molar and social production and its relationship to the representation applied to it, right? That is itself a whole, to put it simply, that is a question of the apparatus and the production, right? And then we have the molecular in terms of its production and the way that all three of these things fit together. And that, I think, is like, to give a very simple schema, the crux of this. Because any political change, any question of emancipation is going to have to deal with those terms. And it won't be, to get another conclusion, it won't be sufficient to simply focus on the molar, nor will it be sufficient to simply focus on the representation. The limit of capital as socius, right? The absolute limit, I think is what they call it, is the body without organs. That becomes the condition, to use one of Guattari's terms from his earlier writing, and it's a term I'm a really big fan of. That becomes the condition for producing, I suppose the technical term, for producing getting unstuck, to get out of being stuck.
I think that's very well put, I think. Does that answer, Misha, or anyone else?
Yeah. And it's good timing because I also have to go now.
And I think we all do.
English, though.
I think we all do. So with that, I am going to close this out because we went a little bit overboard tonight. That's great. Thank all of you for joining us. Next week we will be continuing. Next week we will not be continuing. I'm taking next week off again. I know I just did this for my own surgery. I'm not going to be doing this. My daughter's being born next Monday. And that's at the latest. So it's a fairly guaranteed thing. So probably not going to do readings next week. And the week after, at some point, we will be continuing 4.4. And please join us when we do. I'd love to have those conversations. Thank all of you for joining us. And I'll talk to you next time.